this discourse about Chinese debt trap diplomacy, etc., is deployed precisely to essentially try to ensure that China carries the can for Western bad lending, right? But the third thing I would say is that at the end of the day, for the Chinese, it is much easier to write off a bad debt than it is in the West. Why? Because Western governments are committed to preserving the profits of predatory lenders, which is not necessarily the case in China.
Professor Desai, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thanks very much, Jyotishman. It's a great privilege and honor to be here. Yeah, and to talk to people in India about India, etc. So.
Yeah, so I thought your new book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy, is a good background to have this discussion about the times we live in. So why not start by you giving us a background about why did you choose to write again on capitalism in the context of the war and the coronavirus pandemic?
When you say again, you mean after my geopolitical economy?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point. So, after my 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization, and sorry, how does it go? After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. That's the thing. Anyway, after that, I continued to pay attention because that was really, it laid the foundations for the manner in which I view the world economy. And of course, having done that, I continued to examine how the world economy was faring. And as you know, that was published in 2013, already after 2008, what I call the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2008, and the decade since that, decade and a half now, since then, capitalism has simply been limping along. I mean, in fact, around 2008, I actually wrote, an article simply saying that this was the end of neoliberalism, but neoliberalism continued to inhabit the halls of policy and power and so on. And that meant that, in fact, capitalism's malaise just got worse. So I continued to do that. And indeed, so once the pandemic hit, I realized that one of the biggest stories about the pandemic was not going to be about the pandemic itself. Of course, that was important, but how the pandemic would, the way I like to put it, tell on capitalism. That is to say, and do so in both of the meanings of the term, because in one meaning, to tell on something is to essentially to reveal its dirty secrets, right? So, of course, we all saw the ugly underbelly of capitalism, the productive debility, the inequality, the discrimination, the racism, the misogyny. All of this was completely there for all to see. But the other meaning of telling on something is to put an unbearable burden on them. So, if you can say, well, Joe's cancer is really telling on him. That is to say, it's really weakening him, etc., etc. So similarly, this coronavirus was telling on capitalism in the sense of weakening it further. So originally, the book was going to be about capitalism and coronavirus. And I had written an opening article in Canadian Dimension, which is a left magazine here, in which was entitled "Capitalism and Coronavirus: The Unexpected Reckoning." Because just a few weeks before the WHO declared the pandemic, I had been asked to give a talk on, and we went back and forth. It was just a community organization. We went back and forth about what I would talk about. And then the lady who was inviting me said, why don't we just call it, Does Capitalism Have a Future? So I began my lecture by saying, the short answer is no. Now I'm going to spend the rest of the 45 minutes telling you why. So I'd already been sort of thinking along these lines. I write journalistically, so I had been writing about how, prominent economists, people like Nouriel Roubini and others were also saying, another reckoning is coming, etc., etc. Well before the pandemic, anybody ever thought about the pandemic ever hitting the world and so on. So there was that. And so that was my argument in The Unexpected Reckoning, is that capitalism it was telling on capitalism. And what's more, not only was capitalism going to be found wanting in standing up to the challenge of this capitalist countries, particularly the most neoliberal and financialized countries like the United States and the UK above all, but even their coping mechanisms, that is to say their politics, would be found unable to deal with it. So that was the overall argument. And then as it happened, I was delayed in submitting the manuscript. I was going to submit it sometime in 2021. That's right, 2021, but then I wasn't able to do that. Then it was delayed, and we were into 2022. The conflict over Ukraine erupted, and I realized that my view on that, because I'd been following very closely also what was happening there, that it also related to the same problems of capitalism. I mean, insofar as you see the Ukraine conflict as a proxy war that the United States is waging against Russia, using Ukrainians as proxies, as Mearsheimer says, fighting Russia till the last Ukrainian. If you think about this, then the conflict in that way, then it relates to exactly the same problems of capitalism that I was relating to coronavirus. So I decided to extend the book. It was impossible to ignore the war anyway. So I extended the analysis and I submitted the manuscript in the summer of 2022.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that surprised me as I started the book was that even though the introduction, presumably written after, started with the pandemic and the war, the structure of the book is more about revisiting history and theories of capitalism. It gives a huge outlay to British capitalism, then the US capitalism, and obviously, what you call the productive sectors of the economy, like Germany and Japan alongside. And then obviously towards the end, you revisit the war and the pandemic. One of the things you say, I'm not sure if you may say this in the introduction or a later chapter, that you were not satisfied with the commentaries from the Western reformist left that started with the pandemic, but also carried over to the war. And one of the missing things that you found was capitalism. You mentioned the likes of Piketty, Klein, Mazzucato, Neil Ferguson, and so on. So in a way, it's a book on capitalism, right? I mean, it begins and it just goes on and on. So I was thinking if you can give us a layout of how you understand capitalism and how we should be looking at capitalism at this point in time.
Okay, that's another really huge question, and I'll try to do my best. At least let me give you some initial idea, and then you can follow up in whichever direction you like. So essentially, the way I look at capitalism really comes from my reading and rereading of Marx, particularly Marx's Capital, Grundrisse, and his major economic works, and also other works, because the thing is, I feel that Marx has been systematically misunderstood. And in fact, this systematic misunderstanding of Marx pervades much of what, not only much of what calls itself Marxist economics. In fact, I would say that even the term Marxist economics is a bit of an oxymoron, because what Marx did was not economics, because economics implies that you separate the economy out of the rest of society and say it is a self-regulating sphere of human activity. It's much more Weberian and kind of neoclassical economics than it is Marxism. So in that sense, so to me, Marx did political economy. And so Marx was, to me, the culmination of classical political economy. Marx takes all the gains of classical political economy, as well as all the problems, and then building further on the gains, particularly building further using Hegelian thinking which takes into account the totality and which looks for the contradiction, taking the gains of classical political economy, applying Hegelian methods to resolve the outstanding problems of classical political economy, questions such as what was value, where does surplus value come from, why is it that, if value comes from labor, that companies that are more labor intensive have lesser rates of profit than companies that are more capital intensive, etc. These are all classical problems. He resolved every one of these problems, and the result of that is an understanding of capitalism as contradictory value production. This is the best way I can summarize it. So it is value production, and in so being, it is different from every other type of human social organization known hitherto, or that we can possibly have in the future. In that sense, it is exceptional. And inherently, value production is contradictory. If you don't put that word in, then also you've lost the plot. So now,
just
yes, sure.
just to seek a little bit of clarity here, when you say it's a contradictory value production, are you limiting yourself in this at this moment to production itself, which is basically I mean, of course, in your book you say that we have to go beyond. It's not just within where value is produced, and there you lay out maybe perhaps 16 different contradictions. But I mean, when you said Marx was dealing with it, did he like does he mean the sort of falling rate of profit and overproduction, or does he also mean going beyond the crisis of money, credit, nation states, and so on and so forth?
That's a very good question. And so a lot of people say, well, what is Marx doing, in Capital, if he's not talking about economics? He was only talking about production. Of course, he's talking about both production and realization, but we'll leave that aside. But what Marx is doing in Capital is he's reconstructing the core mechanisms of capitalism, what the mechanisms that make it distinctive from any other form of social production. But no capitalism can exist abstractly. It always exists in actually existing societies, and it requires of actually existing societies such modifications as to open up new fronts for creating contradictions. In fact, another way of understanding this is the following. I quote this, I discuss this in the book, and I've quoted it in many other places. In a letter to Conrad Schmidt, Engels, in the 1890s, I believe, clarified to his friend that that there can be no such thing as pure capitalism. And he said, we revolutionaries will never let it get to that, because quite frankly, any purely capitalist society, which would be just a society composed of capitalists and workers, is absolutely impossible, for the sheer reason that capitalism itself requires, because it requires cheap labor, that a substantial section of the society not be workers and be the producers of workers, etc., etc. So, I mean, so essentially, capitalism is like a big and slightly brutish baby. It wants everything all at once, and everything, and it's contradictory and all at once. And so it manufactures contradictions all along. So yes, I focus on what I call the core processes of value production, but I also focus on then what getting these core processes going requires of the rest of society if capitalism is to establish itself. And all these requirements create new forms of contradiction. So in a certain sense, what I'm also doing is I'm emphasizing that so in that sense, this idea that what Marx is doing in Capital is no different from what neoclassical economists are doing is simply false. Marx recognizes that there are contradictions within value production, and also recognizes that capitalism itself is the most unnatural productive system that you could ever possibly have. So that's some of how I understand capitalism. And so for the rest, what I was going to say is that the way I understand capitalism is slightly different, or very different from, as I say, much of what passes for Marxist economics. Because as I've argued in many writings, when I started writing geopolitical economy, which was a way of trying to understand the international relations of the capitalist world in a Marxist sense, I found myself writing a whole lot of subsidiary writings as a way of sort of clearing the underbush, so that I could secure the kind of understanding of Marxism that I felt was accurate. And in doing so, I found myself essentially criticizing a number of key propositions of what passes for Marxist economics. Propositions such as Marx never thought that there was a demand problem. complete rubbish. There is evidence in Grundrisse, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, and I've written a long article marshalling all this evidence, which says the Marx thought not only was this a problem, it was possibly the principal problem of capitalism. The second point is that Marx was wrong about falling rates of profits. Again, there's absolutely, the very grounds on which Marx is said to be wrong about falling rates of profit, that is, capitalists wouldn't invest if they thought the rates of profit would fall. Marx had dealt with this objection directly in the discussion of falling rates of profit. So I just don't see why people say that. And finally, that Marx's value analysis suffers from a transformation problem, that they cannot translate values into prices consistently. But again, this completely misunderstands the relationship between value and price, which Marx posited. And so to me, I take all of these things into account, and I produce what I consider to be an understanding of contradictory capitalism as contradictory value production, which is there in Capital, which is there in Marx's writings, not which, is constructed by sort of, parachuting into little bits of these works and then cherry picking some few sentences to make a completely contrary construction of what Marx was talking about. So that's how I understand capitalism.
I also found like your the framework of enlarging contradictions very instructive. I mean, you produce a table, and it's on one hand, you obviously build on the classical understanding of contradiction within the realm of production, which is the vertical contradiction of class struggle and also the horizontal contradiction of competition, which leads to falling prices and then also a crisis of falling rate of profit. But you also say that it doesn't stop there. It goes outside and within the realm of realization and outside. There are contradictions within credit, which is also a contradiction of money, contradictions of nation states, and so on. So just for our viewers, I was wondering if you can just give us a sketch of what you mean by all these contradictions, and do they exist independently or are they part of some same processes of capital?
Yeah, again, I remember this was something I was wrestling with. I said, in Marx already, we know, even on a cursory reading of Marx, that there are a number of, at least more than one crisis mechanism. And then a lot of the debates within Marxism is, about, whether there is one fundamental crisis mechanism. And I was never particularly happy with the way in which these discussions were going. So I remember sort of trying to enumerate, and I even wrote to some friends saying, can you send me, your list of the contradictions Marx talks about? And I got a few of them. And I read Mandel, I read Sweezy, and I see which ones that they were enumerating and so on. But they were all, to me, incomplete lists. So then I sort of began further seriously thinking about this. And so in the process of doing that, I realized that the way to understand, when I say capitalism is contradictory value production, what do I mean? And there is that diagram, which I hope you'll show maybe your viewers in this. But there is that diagram which shows that I think it's best to think of capitalism as having a vertical axis along which value passes from the workers to the capitalists, and then a horizontal axis, which is, so that is the vertical axis is the axis of exploitation and class struggle. And then there is a horizontal axis of the relations among capitalists, the intra-class relations, which are relations of competition in which value flows from the less productive companies to the firms to the more productive ones. So there are two different types of value flows, although I also add, of course, that along the horizontal axis, there are also modes of value distribution which do not arise in this little diagram. And that is, of course, that the holders of land and the holders of capital will take rent and interest as subtractions from profit all along. And that, by the way, is a result of a political struggle. So that already shows you that already within the structure of capitalism, there are these non-economic elements involved right there in the question of how value is distributed among the owners of capital and land in different ways. But anyway, so there is that. So now
Does monopoly capital also fit to that?
Well,
because it's not
this
subject to the pressures of competition in the classic sense.
right. So monopoly capital itself is constantly taking away. In fact, what that does is it takes it increases the transmission of value from the less productive to the more productive, because each monopoly capitalism is essentially taking. So imagine Walmart, for example, is taking profits away from all the mom and pop store owners and the smaller retailers because it is so big. So in that sense, the existence or the arrival of monopoly capitalism does not change this. In fact, it intensifies the value redistribution among capitalists, petty, medium, and of course large and monopoly. So in that sense, so these axes are really helpful ways of thinking about it. And then thinking about the contradictions of capitalism, I found that the contradictions of capitalism, both in the sphere of production and realization, both of which are exceedingly critical and important for Marx. So, you can't have just production. You have to have realization, and value can only be realized in the form in which it must be realized, namely as money, if you have the realm of realization. So then I identified the key contradictions that occur in the realm of production and realization. So the intra-class mechanism is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. The interclass one can be profit squeeze. The intra-class realization problem can be a problem of disproportions. And then the interclass one is, of course, overproduction / underconsumption. By the way, I equate these two terms, and we can have long debates about why it's important to do so. But then I also see that, you can't have capitalism without the institution of money. So then what does capitalism demand from money? And those demands of capitalism can lead to, competition among capitalists can lead to deflation, in the sense that it is the natural tendency of capitalism to depress costs, in competitive capitalism anyway. And the interclass contradiction can lead to inflation and so on. So money, whether it's money or finance, ecology, the state, and of course interstate relations. In each of these, I show how you can have interclass or intra-class forms of contradiction. So that's you can see that from the table and so on. What I also say about capitalism and crises is that in any given crisis, say for example now, or in the 70s or in the 30s, there is always more than any single one of these crisis mechanisms involved. Capitalism is simply so crisis prone. It is impossible to have a crisis in which only one of these mechanisms is involved. Another thing I point out is that you see, precisely because you see capitalism as a whole, you have to see it holistically as a social whole. There can be no capitalism without capitalist states. And quite frankly, capitalist states have to constantly intervene to steady capitalism because it is so crisis prone. And so this history of these interventions themselves create ever new layers of non-economic, I put this heavily in quotation marks, but ever new layers of, shall we say, qualifications and modifications of the processes of value production, which then essentially become part of that particular value production complex. So, there is one history of crises and how they are managed, say, in Britain, and another in Sweden, and yet another in Japan or in India, and so on. And this shapes and reshapes capitalism such as it is all the time. Remember, it's never pure. It always has a social base and a history. And so this history then continues in this fashion. So those are some of the things that I say about capitalism and its crisis surrounding this table to which you referred.
You follow up these discussions, like the more relatively theoretical discussions, with a longer history. I would say dealing with British capitalism in the late 19th century and how they sort of shifted towards finance capitalism, evacuating the realm of production to the US and Germany, and then after the Second World War, the US taking charge of that. Um, So there seems to be these two spheres within capital. One is the sphere of finance, which you say that historically thinkers used to agree that it has to be limited in some ways. Although if one reads Brodel, for instance, he says that this realm of what he calls the anti-capitalist realm of finance has always been very active. This is the realm of the rent seekers and so on. But be that as it may, these two realms of capital flowing into the productive sectors and capital flowing into the more speculative asset uh, uh, um, profiteering sector. Um, Tell us a little bit about these two realms, because it is very critical to understand what neoliberalism is. And your book, I guess, goes on in great detail about it.
Yeah, again, this is an enormous question. So feel
Mhm.
free to interrupt me at any point. And because you see, perhaps the place to begin, because, you're right that neoliberalism is what lies at the heart of all of this. So let's begin with the very simple notion, which I think has largely been forgotten in Marxist discussions. Again, as far as I know, so I could be wrong, and you could correct me. And that is that Marx was writing. Marx passed away in 1883, so he obviously that's when he stopped writing. But already in Capital Volume 3, which was published posthumously, you find that Marx is referring to a very simple notion, and that is that once capitalism arrives at its monopoly stage, and Marx could already see that it was doing so already in in his own lifetime and in his drafts of Volume 3. So once Marx says capitalism arrives at the monopoly stage, it will have become ripe for transformation into socialism. For the simple reason that very simple reasons.
This is similar to Keynes as well, right? When he was
I think
writing.
I think Marx and Keynes have a lot in common. Of course, I think Marx is politically far superior to Keynes. Keynes thought that he could change the world by convincing a few elites with sweet reason, but of course, these elites were not, in fact, very amenable to sweet reason. But so, in that sense, I think Marx is much the greater thinker. But yes, I think Keynes not only was very similar to Marx, we can also show that he borrowed substantially from Marx. He thought that Marx's formula of MC M dash was brilliant. He understood all of these. Anyway, we can go on about that. But so to come back to it, it was ripe for transition. Why? Because whatever was historically progressive about capitalism consisted in the fact that in its competitive phase, essentially, capitalism develop the forces of production. Of course, it did it brutally by imposing high costs on workers in particular. It did it chaotically because capitalism was inherently anarchistic, but somehow it did so. It advanced the forces of production.
And with colonization and all.
And well, I think Marx, well, we'll come back to that if you like, because I think Marx fully understood the idea of the exploitation of one nation by another. And in one of my most favorite quotes from Marx, he actually says, in the free trade debates already in the 1840s, he says that if these gentlemen, his interlocutors, do not understand how one nation can grow rich at the expense of another nation, how are they going to understand that one class can grow rich at the expense of another class? So right there, he is putting nation and class as two axes along which exploitation takes place. So, but let's leave that aside. I agree with you, but I think Marx, had he actually written the whole of Capital, remember, it was going to be a many-volume work of which only one was published in his lifetime. But in my geopolitical economy work, I show that Marx would have totally agreed with our understanding of imperialism in all its various forms. I mean, as an unequal exchange, as exploitation of cheaper labor, all of these things. Imposition of debt slavery, all these things. Anyway, he would have understood all those things. But let me come back to the actual question that you had posed about. So the point is that competitive capitalism develops the forces of production, naturally leading to monopoly, because what is the end result of competition? It is to leave one or a few companies standing. They are the most efficient. And now what you see is that the socialization of labor, which earlier was in the form of essentially the market relations among many firms, now reaches a new peak in the form of the complex socialization of labor in giant firms with thousands of workers involved in a very complex division of labor. Now, capitalism has done its work and social ownership can take over. And moreover, in that
This
same
is the transition to factory system.
no, transition to monopoly, to the
Okay.
monopoly phase, right? So in the competitive phase, you have a very complex division of labor, which is both division of labor within the firm as well as between firms. But increasingly, that between firms element kind of goes out the window, and you get an even bigger and more complex division of labor within giant firms in the monopoly phase. So that's one element. And of course, there are many other elements, because Marx said by the time you get here, people will see that that essentially the capitalist is just like a little cherry on the cake. It's performing no real valuable function that can be removed and replaced by the social ownership and social organization of labor. All of this is in a very short and sweet chapter 27 of volume 3. People can give yourself a treat and read it, so an intellectual treat. And I mean a treat in various other ways, a political treat as well. So really, we were already at this phase in the early 20th century. And then, of course, this phase itself, combined as it was with imperialism, and so on, competitive imperialism released its own dynamics and contradictions and culminated in the First World War, which, by the way, is simply, which inaugurated what I like to see with Arno Meyer as a single 30 years crisis, which included the Second World War, the Great Depression, etc. So this massive crisis of capitalism. And then at the end of, and you have to realize that people were very aware at the time that the war was an anti-imperialist war, the First World War, and for that matter, the Second World War. And that, in between there was the Great Depression, which again discredited capitalism, etc. So all of these, by the end of this horrendous period, people thought, people like Keynes, people like Polanyi and many others, they thought that there would be a distinctive turn to the left the world over. That somehow essentially people would choose socialism because capitalism had proved so costly. Of course, we know that this didn't happen, not quite anyway, but, on the face, and because, and I should also say people like Hayek feared the same outcome, which is why Hayek wrote his Road to Serfdom, etc. And people say, oh, but you know what, this is completely wrong. After the Second World War, capitalism experienced its golden age, and what are you talking about, and so on. But think about it. The world turned left in a distinctive fashion. There was a vast communist world. In the capitalist world itself, they had to essentially, as I like to put it, ring around monopoly capitalism with a whole lot of socialistic measures, whether it was commitment to full employment or welfare states or free education and healthcare, or at least state-provided relatively cheap education and healthcare, blah, blah, etc. I mean, and all of this essentially massively expanded domestic demand, and it did so precisely at the time when these countries were about to lose the colonies on which they had depended for at least some of this demand. So this massive expansion of demand domestically gave capitalism its 30 best years, its 3 best decades. And of course, finally, just to finish the point about the world turning left at the end of the Second World War, the newly independent countries were trying to pursue their various forms of autonomous national development, what Prabhat Patnaik calls dirigist development, quite rightly, in ways that were distinctly socialistic, if not socialist. There was definitely left-leaning projects and so on, in which, by the way, the experiences of the Soviet Union or China were deemed more relevant than the experiences of the West, and quite rightly. So in a way, the world did turn left. And capitalism enjoyed its so-called golden age precisely because of these ways in which capitalism was heavily reformed and modified in a socialistic direction, if definitely not socialist, but in a socialistic direction. But when the underlying structure of capitalism nevertheless led to crisis by the 1970s, there was, the left was already very debilitated, and we can have a completely long discussion about why it was debilitated. But it was basically, I mean, it did fight. The 1970s were a very politically fractious decade, during which both the left and the right kind of duked it out a fair bit. But in the end, the right won, and we got neoliberalism. And many Marxists thought, okay, this is going to revive capitalism, and capitalism is going to continue to. And there are still these Marxists around. To me, they're not really Marxists, they're Schumpeterians. For them, capitalism is, this ever self-regenerating social force, and it will never die, sort of thing. And the only way we can bring about socialism is through sheer force of effort. Everybody will have read Capital and will decide to smash down the ramparts of capitalism. But of course, that is not how these things happen. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that 40 years of neoliberalism has, if they have made one thing clear, it is that Marx was right about monopoly capital, that left to itself, monopoly capital cannot regain, which is what kind of neoliberalism has tried to do. It has stepped back from regulating it, removed social obligations to workers, etc. So you gave capital lots of freedoms. It did not regain its productive mojo in the what I call the homelands of capitalism. It has in fact productively declined further, and only engaged in financialization. So this outcome is, to me, proof that the golden age was not due to the mojo of capitalism. It was due to the socialistic measures, and that we need them again. But the point is that if we once again employ them, knowing what has happened under neoliberalism, the only way to proceed will then be to continue to employ these measures until we've gone well beyond capitalism into some form of socialism. So that's my general idea. So we haven't talked about financialization, but I just wanted to make sure that this part of the story was clear, because essentially, left to itself, neoliberal capital, given more freedoms by neoliberal policymakers, has not produced a more productive economy. It has simply produced a heavily financialized economy.
So, do a very quick follow-up on this phase. I mean, this phase of the long boom, like post-war to, let's say, the 1970s, when the crisis really began. Do you think this was possible because of a massive destruction within the sort of global north, definitely Europe and parts of Japan and so on, coupled with the new states that emerged within the global south? So is it very Schumpeterian in a way, or do you think that within capitalism there is an enormous space in which you can concede full employment and high wages? Because people like Prabhat Patnaik say that this is bound to fail, because this phase of golden phase of capitalism came about at the first place by imposition of tremendous austerity in the global south. And this is where I have a big quibble with the austerity literature that comes in the from the out of the global north, because it says that austerity has happened something since the last 40 or 50 years, while I look at the history of the global south and it seems like capitalism has always been austerity capitalism. So yeah, my question is, was that phase an exception in the history of capitalism rather than something which we can be very optimistic about in terms of replicating that in the future?
Okay, so again, you've asked a lot of things, and I hope I will respond to all or most of them. So first of all, I completely agree with Prabhat, and Prabhat is Prabhat and Utsa are sort of two of my leading lights. So don't get me wrong. I mean, we may not agree about every last point, but I agree on the broad things they say. But even Prabhat and Utsa would say, first of all, that let me make that the second point. The first point I want to make is that my whole point is that, yes, capitalism was massively reformed, but the underlying structure did remain capitalist, and it led to crisis by the 70s. So the fact that something can't be sustained, imagine that you have a kid learning how to ride a bicycle. They are still very unsteady, okay? And you know that they're going to fall at some point, but if they still cover 10 meters, before falling, then they have covered those 10 meters before falling. And that's the kind of, that was the golden age, right? That they did cover that period before falling into crisis at the end of 3 decades, or roughly. It was already brewing by the late 60s, but whatever. So that's what the sort of thing. So the contradiction is there, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't some stabilizing effect. In fact, there was a great stabilizing effect of these, what I call the socialistic measures. Now, the second point you made was that, wasn't this spurt of growth entirely a result of the fact that the defeated capitalist economies, in particular Germany and Japan, of course, needed to be reconstructed? Undoubtedly, there was a huge element of that. And this is why, as I like to say, the golden age was much more golden in these countries, because they experienced, the Wirtschaftswunder and so on, the miracle economies of Germany and Japan in the post-war period. But finally, precisely because of the threat of communism, capitalism, that is to the United States in particular, had to permit these countries a level of state intervention, a level of protection, a level of policy autonomy, which it would rather not have given, but had to give, because had it not done so, then the inevitable economic crises within these countries, which would have come much quicker than the 30 years after which they came, the inevitable crises would simply whet the population's appetite, which was already quite high, for some kind of socialism. Because remember, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, there were strong communist sympathies, particularly at the end of the Second World War. And the whole Cold War offensive was, of course, very primarily focused on trying to destroy these. So anyway, so that's the second point I would make. Now, thirdly, you pointed out austerity, the third world, etc. I would say that in the period, and I think Prabhat and Utsa would agree with me, but I guess we will find out if they do hear this, or we can put it to them. But the question is, I completely agree with you that austerity is the normal functioning of capitalism. And remember also that before the golden age, even the working classes of Western countries didn't have the sort of privileges. I mean, they had fewer ones. They did gain more privileges as a result of their organization and so on. And also, one might say, their agreement also to be complicit with imperialism. That is another huge problem, which is a Pandora's box that we can unpack. But nevertheless, they did gain many concessions and so on. But they reached the peak in the post-Second World War period. So,
and this started mostly after the First World War.
Yes,
the labor upsurge in Europe, also New Deal after Depression in
exactly.
the US.
And there was some of that in Germany in particular, with Bismarckian policies and so on. But anyway, let's continue. So the thing is that this period, that is to say the post-Second World War period, between roughly 45 and 80, there essentially in the third world countries also, with the attempts to create dirigist forms of development, there was a different policy regime, which once again the United States had to tolerate, because not tolerating that, imposing the sort of neoliberalism that they had imposed in the 80s and they began to impose in the 80s and 90s, would have been politically unacceptable and probably impossible as well in terms of the international power of the United States. So in that sense, I think the austerity regime really came back with neoliberalism. It did not necessarily exist in this period. Yes, there is a sense in which in this period, thanks to the fact that developing countries did not achieve the great successes of development they wished to achieve, and therefore remain dependent on exporting primary commodities in particular, primary commodities remain relatively low cost. And I think Prabhat's work has been outstanding in pointing to the centrality of cheap commodities in fueling the boom, or post-Second World War boom. But I wouldn't say that he thought that we had austerity then just as we have austerity now, or we had austerity before. I don't think he'd agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because I think if you look at tax structure, the tax regime and so on, it definitely doesn't look like we had austerity in much of the global south, even in the post-war pre-1980s. But when I said that we did have austerity, I was looking at the labor conditions
Yes.
not in China, but definitely in India, for instance. It has been, as all scholars agree on this point, that it's like 95% of the working class under informal sector. So we
Absolutely.
never had that. We definitely had very heavy regulations of capital. We definitely had higher outlay towards taxation, and that did lead to some redistribution and so on. But if a non-austerity based regime involves high wages and benefits, securities of job, permanent employment, and so on and so forth, all of these things that we had, at least until in China, until I would say 1990s, not 1970s, and some of them still continues today, but massively dismantled after 90s. And here we might have slight disagreement as well. That was not the case in India and large parts of the global south, including Africa.
No, I mean, I agree that on the whole, I would say that the working class in India did not really have the same, I mean, obviously, they didn't have the same sort of conditions as the working class had in first world countries. And remember also that even in the first world countries, say, for example, in the United States, the black working classes did not have anywhere near the sort of, the sort of good conditions, better working conditions. That is to say, undoubtedly, the Keynesian social democratic welfare state conditions for labor were, of course, much more richer and generous in Western countries, particularly for the white working class. Certainly, I would agree that the same cannot be said for countries like India or the third world more generally. But I think you could also argue that conditions were better in this period before 1980 than they subsequently became. That's my main point.
All right. So maybe like very quickly, what's your understanding of neoliberalism? Because it's a big word, right? We can see that in terms of upward redistribution of wealth. We can see that in terms of what is called as the deregulation of industrial relations. We can see that in terms of market expansion, globalization. So how do you look at, or even large liquidity and so on, expansion of the credit market. So there's a lot that comes to my mind
Yes.
when one says neoliberalism. It's so much that it's very difficult to make an analysis. What's your analysis of neoliberalism?
Yeah, so let me just mention a handful of things that I would say I consider distinctive to my understanding of neoliberalism. So firstly, neoliberalism is supposed to be about expanding markets and competition and so on. But in reality, they have not been about expanding markets or the sphere of markets or competition. Neoliberalism has been primarily about advancing the power of big monopoly corporations. So that's point number one. Point number two is that in the era of monopoly capitalism, which we had already entered in the early 20th century, the only thing neoliberalism could achieve in terms of its, shall we say, its policy successes, I put it heavily in ironic quotation marks, is that by giving more and more freedoms to this sort of capital, that is to say to big monopoly capital, all it managed to achieve was not the productive revitalization of the economies, which, could not happen because these economies were already dominated by big monopoly corporations, and giving them more freedom was not going to increase their investment or their cost effectiveness or anything like that. It simply meant that they could charge whatever they liked for what they wanted to produce, hence today's talk of greedflation and so on. But what it did achieve was to massively expand the realm of finance, which also one of the key elements of neoliberalism has been the systematic deregulation of all fields of capitalist activity, but particularly of financial activity. So, in the UK, you got the Big Bang reforms. In the US, after particularly from the 1970s onwards, basically, even under Paul Volcker, but particularly accelerating under Alan Greenspan, reaching a peak in the 1999 repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, there was unrelenting financial deregulation, and including changes to tax laws, which gave much more favorable treatment to rentier incomes than to earned incomes. So that also had an effect. So this is a second aspect of neoliberalism, which I think must be emphasized, which is that it has led directly to financialization. And by the way, and this is related to the third aspect. If you consider the fact that, as I consider it, that one of the big issues, one of the reasons why we went into the long downturn, which began in the 1970s, is because the existing demand was saturated. And therefore, the only way in which you could get a more reinvigorated productive capitalism was to expand demand. Now, neoliberalism, by attacking labor, by attacking wages, by rolling back the social wage, and social spending of all sorts, by privatization, etc., which, by the way, also had the direct effect. People, with privatization, what happens is people who once had very good state jobs with good wages and working conditions and benefits suddenly were transformed into private sector workers who had none of those things, right? So naturally, this depresses demand. So neoliberalism, rather than solving the problem of saturated demand, only exacerbated it. Now, in these conditions, naturally, if you or I were capitalists, we would be dumb to make an investment. Why should we invest in productive activity when we know that the market is saturated? There are no profits to be made. So as a result, you got increasing amounts, like vast tsunamis of capital sloshing about in the financial system, seeking profits on ever thinner margins, right? So again, in the financial system also, part of what we are looking at is not that people are just making big fat profits. No, on the contrary, in order to chase those profits, people engage in leverage trading, because the margins are so thin. You can only make a substantial profit if you throw vast quantities of capital. And even these Mr. Moneybags do not have the kind of capital they need, so they borrow so much of it in order to engage in leverage trading. So the demand problem is exacerbated and directly contributes to financialization, because what happens? You're not investing productively. So then what are you doing? You're stashing your cash. Where are you stashing it? You're stashing it into some or the other niche of the ever expanding financial system. So that is another element of neoliberalism. And I suppose a final thing I might want to add.
The last demand, just to lay out for the viewers, is a sort of demise of the post-Keynesian consensus, that somehow you can revive capitalism through increasing effective demand by
Yes,
redistributing parts of the profit.
Well, it's not the demise of that. Well, it is a result of the demise of that consensus. I mean, the thing is that I mean, first of all, let me say, even when we had the Keynesian welfare state, the consensus was actually much more limited. They did not necessarily, all they wanted to do was essentially to smooth out the cycles of capitalism. If you read Keynes, his conclusions are much more radical than that, but we'll leave that aside. But okay, but it is policy. It's not that the idea was invalid. The idea remains valid today. It's just that policymakers and politicians discarded that idea. So yes, absolutely. And they basically don't give a fig about demand. So as a consequence, essentially, you have a capitalism where as I say, certainly within the advanced capitalist countries, the imperialist countries, let's call them, within these countries, they have also are suffering from one or the other degree of deindustrialization, and the only way in which and one of the results of that is, of course, the shift of industry to other parts of the world, not through foreign direct investment, much more through outsourcing, which is a very different sort of relationship. But anyway, that's for another period. But those, and I was going to make a final point, which is that, you see, I would say today that neoliberal capitalism, that is to say, a capitalism which one-sidedly favors the interests of big capital and is committed to retaining the private power of these big capitalist corporations through whatever it takes in terms of state action, this is the final form of capitalism. Like, if you move away from this, you will not get anything else. That's what I'm trying to say, is that if you move away from this towards some form of reformed capitalism of the post-Second World War variety, then you will have to continue to go down the road to socialism. In any case, today, this sort of capitalism has absolutely nothing to add, not an iota to add to human welfare, and by its existence, which essentially has been unnecessarily prolonged by neoliberal policy, is only increasing the misery of people around the world.
Mm-hmm. I had at least two questions if your time permits. I mean, we might run a little over, but if your time permits, we are fine with that. Um, uh, yeah, so I want to end with the final section of your book. What does the pandemic and the war led to our understanding of capitalism and so on? Coming to the more contemporary. But before that, I just wanted you to respond to one of my, uh, let's say, problems with even large sections of Marxist scholars, how they see the impending demise of capitalism. And I'm not Schumpeterian in that sense that, destruction would allow to regenerate capital and so on. But I am much more reluctant to see the demise of capitalism as many of the scholars tend to see. And part of my reason is that I look at long history of capitalism. I look at the crisis it overcomes. Um, and even these shifts, like there is a classical way of looking at capitalism through stages, like mercantile capitalism, and that's I think is now not accepted by anyone. How I look at it is this tremendous oscillations and shifts within space and within time. So even this hide and seek between the realm of finance and realm of production, we look at the long history of capitalism, we see that shifts constantly occurring within time and within space. Um, I mean, so this is the how Dutch capitalism, for instance, would go into the realm of finance, relegating production to England, and then England would follow the same, relegating it to Germany, and so on. Obviously, the colonized world remained, and more recently, we see how things were offshore to China and the rest of the global south, while finance becoming the dominant sector in the West, but definitely in US and UK. So my question is, the pointed question is, or my charge or allegation is that, uh, are you too quick to see the demise of capitalism?
Well, I will plead not guilty to that charge. I think that for a number of reasons, like I said, the part of the reason why I went through that long disquisition about monopoly capitalism and then its crisis, 30 years crisis, and how people thought it was going to end. And it apparently didn't seem to end, and the neoliberalism and so on. Part of the reason for telling this whole story, which is told in much greater detail in the book, is to say that, capitalism is it's not like a yo-yo, that you have a crisis, then capitalism regenerates, and no. Capitalism is contradictory value production. Capitalism's contradictions regularly produce crises. In response to these crises, states inevitably have to manage these crises. And today, this long history of managing of crises has brought capitalism to the point where essentially the alternatives are exhausted. That's the first thing I'd like to say. And also, it is producing levels of dysfunction, particularly in the United States and the UK, where basically in the United States, we could easily be looking at civil war in the run-up to the next election. This is not unconnected. It's not something peculiar to the United States. It's a direct result of the particular type of neoliberal capitalism you have in the United States. You already, in a certain sense, you have to see the vote for Trump as a result. It's a morbid symptom of the fact that the left essentially is nowhere to be seen, although who knows, hopefully it will reappear. But in these years, it has been nowhere to be seen. So the working people, or enough of the working people, were inveigled into voting for a charlatan like Trump. So, but this, what it represents is a hunger for change. And that change is not being supplied. People are fed up to hear of the existing system. And there is absolutely no way that capitalism can continue to exist if these people's demands were actually fulfilled. And I personally don't see that, you can put it off for that long. I mean, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. Okay, so that's one thing. The second reason why I think it's definitely coming to an end, and as I grow older and wiser, I see more and more the truth, and in deeper ways and broader ways, I see the truth of the fact that capitalism is an imperialist system. And the more the countries that are, that are imperialized, shall we say, the more the rest of the world, the third world, let's say, refuses to give some of the benefits to imperialism that it has accrued in the past, the fewer will be the options of capitalism. And to me, the rise of multipolarity, which is not a one-way affair, it can be set back by people like Modi, and it can be set back by people like Bolsonaro and regimes. I don't think the individuals are necessarily important, but these regimes can set it back. But the broader push of history is in that direction. And as power distributes itself more and more, as people realize that if they were to try to emulate what passes for capitalism in the United States or in the UK, they will be a lot less well off than they are today, then there is no other way but to go into some kind of socialist system. So to me, I absolutely don't think that I'm being optimistic. My real fear, I'm not being too optimistic. My real fear is that the left has been set back so much that capitalism is visibly crumbling. But there is no left to take charge and say, okay, we can reorganize this system and we can take these societies in a different direction. We might be seeing the crumbling of capitalism and the social decay and disorganization that it will generate, including possibly civil wars, for some time, unless a mass left makes its presence felt in all the countries of the world, I would say today, in the capitalist countries, in the former communist countries, in the third world. Everywhere we need a left. And I think that, a large part of the reason why such a left does not exist, and I go back to my critique of what passes for Marxist economics, because, as I say, it has a Schumpeterian conception of capitalism. It thinks that capitalism has solved all the problems of production. All we have to worry about is distribution. They couldn't be more wrong. And what it's going to need is we are going to have to start thinking about old-fashioned communist issues like planning, nationalization, etc., reindustrialization, all of these sorts of things, obviously with an ecological thing in mind, because, we haven't mentioned ecology, but the fact is the ecological crisis is also directly connected with neoliberalism. People say that the ecological crisis is because of human beings, Anthropocene, or because of capitalism or Capitalocene. But I think it's a kind of neoliberalocene, because if you look at a graph of any of the indices that show you the extent of, show you the progress of the ecological problem, whether it is loss of biodiversity or climate change or what have you, you will see that circa 1980, all of these graphs, which maybe have been growing, suddenly go more steeply upwards. And so, there's another really interesting issue. People say it's all about growth. The neoliberal decades have actually delivered less growth. But with less growth, we have actually degraded the environment much faster. So think about that. I mean, this is what capitalism has to give to the world. So the world had better turn away from that.
Absolutely. So much to talk about the non-existence of the left as we limp from one crisis to another, but I'm sure that would be another day. I'm very tempted to end this conversation with a question that would do so much injustice to our discussion because it might partly move away from your book. But I also have another questions which might be boring and to your dismay that may be related to the book. So which one would you like to have?
I think you should ask the one you want to ask.
All right. So just to
Give
set
in to temptation, I say.
all right, just to set aside the boring question, which was like, what did the pandemic and the war, which was about so significantly about your book, reveal about neoliberal capitalism? Maybe it's also fair because then the viewer should read the book and not take everything from this discussion. But the question that I now want to ask is the the place of China in this. You have been a tremendous force in a way. I mean, although you might not like, the word force with just one person, because you guys are doing great work in terms of groups to counter the anti-China propaganda of not just the West. Now, I would say it has become very global in so many ways, and it's so helpful in that. Um, my question basically is, how do you look at the role of China uh, within global capitalism? Because when I read your work, you use the word socialist China, with which I don't have much problem in terms of geopolitics. Because BRICS as an institution is significantly different from the IMFs and the World Bank. Military alliances like the NATO is very different and imperialistic than some of the Shanghai Corporation organization kind of experiments and so on and so forth. Even Belt and Road initiatives, apart from some of the debt problems that are there, again, which is always inflated in terms of propaganda. I haven't seen much of an imperialistic agenda there. So apart from all these positives, where I'm not very convinced about is the complete dissociation of China within a neoliberal capitalist world order that we live in, whether looked at from the realm of production, how part of that was offshored, and how that the whole deficit, uh, the trade deficit that US runs, which is so central uh, to financialization of capital and everything. It's hard for me to sort of set aside China, or it's hard for me to see China as something completely out of the whole process. So maybe you can counter, or you can allay some of my fears here.
But I'm glad you gave into that temptation, because
Mhm.
actually it touches on one of the very important themes of the book as well. So let's return to that. And I agree with you. If people want to know about what I say about coronavirus and war, which by the way is quite sensational, so please read the book. But let me answer this question. It's a very good question. So and I'm glad you gave into the temptation. So here's the thing. First of all, let me say that I think you put your question in a very sophisticated way. I've never heard it put this way. So thank you for that. I think you're clearly separating what's happening on the international level, or at least distinguishing between what's happening at the international level and then within China. But first of all, let me say that you expressed a misapprehension that is quite widely misapprehension which is quite widespread, and that is that the financialization is based on the United States trade deficit, for which of course China is responsible to a very great extent. And that's partly the reason why you are saying, how can you see China as something completely outside? But I'll come back to that. But first, let's take this whole trade deficit and financialization matter. The financialization of the world, which you can measure through a number of different metrics. One very simple one is how much, what is the discrepancy between the trade flows, which may be say 100, and the financial flows around the world? Because in an ordinary world, the trade flows and the financial flows should be in service of trade flows. They are many times higher, like hundreds of times higher, maybe thousands of times higher, I forget. The point I'm trying to make is that the trade deficit, or the trade deficit of the United States, or the trade surplus of China, is not responsible for financialization. What is, and by the way, we missed out a whole element of the book, both this one and my previous book, Geopolitical Economy, because this is primarily about the international monetary system, the sterling system and the dollar system. And what I've argued is that the financialization has also been very important. It has been essentially the foundation of the dollar system after 1971. So the extent of capital flows that are taking place have nothing to do with trade and trade deficits and surpluses, and everything to do with the vast expansion of the market for dollar-denominated assets of various sorts, whether they are stocks, bonds, derivatives, you name it, housing at one point and securities based on that, etc. There is a massive expansion of that, and that has essentially propped up the dollar system by creating an artificial demand for dollars. So when you're trying to look at, after the 2008 financial crisis, everybody from President George Bush to Alan Greenspan to everybody was saying, oh, it's the Chinese, they are saving too much, and that's why we have this crisis, etc. Had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with the fact that financial institutions, primarily in other rich countries, but also financial institutions and high net worth individuals around the world, are putting their money in dollar-denominated assets, which has nothing to do with trade, or not even anything to do.
Would you take a very quick response to that?
Yeah.
I mean, I would not. I mean, I would not use the word responsible, but what I was saying is that when large chunks of capital withdraws from the productive sectors at one place, you have to get the basic necessities of life being produced somewhere. And that has to be produced in surplus. And if you read, for instance, some of the changes after the 80s, but more significantly in the 90s, that happened within industrial relations within the PRC, the destructions of the Maoist consensus was because now they had to produce in surplus. So why part of those transitions were made was because market relations were made operative, so that surplus had. So I'm not saying that overvaluation of finance capital, predatory lending and everything is because China is producing more materials, because China is producing more shirts or more Apple phones and so on and so forth. What I am saying is that China's place or China's productive sector's place is part of a larger capitalist transition. And I'm no way holding them responsible for that. I mean, they are improving the conditions of, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I mean, okay, that's a very important clarification, and it sort of then saves me from kind of saying some of these things, which are absolutely true. But let me park that for a minute, because what I thought you were referring to is that the trade deficit and the Chinese holding all these reserves and holding them in dollars was essentially propping up.
I know that's
and
the right.
That is a very widespread misapprehension.
Yeah.
That's why I was, but anyway, so that's dealt with. Now, what you are then talking about is the notion of chimerica, the fact that the United States and the Chinese economies are so intertwined that essentially they are like a single economy or something like that, and undoubtedly there is a certain truth to that, particularly for the decade that went from roughly the middle of the 90s to the middle of the 2000s. But I would say that since that time, even before the 2008 crisis, the Chinese were sort of beginning to move away from that. Exports as a proportion of GDP, if I recall correctly, was beginning to decline, and so on. And I would say that, so to me, you were asking about, why I consider China socialist and so on, and let's bracket all the things we agree about at the international level, and let's focus on what domestically. So I would say that it's China is socialist in a meaningful sense, but that doesn't mean that there are no contradictions within the system. To me, when I visit China very often, I talk to Chinese intellectuals. I'm very closely connected with a whole bunch of what I consider to be the left-wing Chinese intellectuals, because in China there is a vast political spectrum. Like there are the socialists and the communists, and then there are the neoliberals. And so within the party state, there is always a contest. And I would say that you would probably be right in saying that certainly in this decade from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, you had a period during which China was perhaps the neoliberals had the bit between their teeth, and they were taking China in the direction of exactly this sort of, essentially producing cheap goods for the United States. And remember, the low level of inflation in advanced industrial countries had very much to do with this, rather than any magic performed by central bankers and so on. So I would agree with you, but already within the system, the contest among different factions of the party, I would say probably the requirement of delivering some sort of betterment of life for the legitimacy of the party state, etc., has been pushing, and then of course eventually the 2008 financial crisis has been pushing China away from that, so that after 2008 you got this massive investment boom. Then after that was exhausted, there was a conscious decision to allow wages to rise. Along with that, there has come this housing boom that is now also kind of seeing a natural end, because some of these companies are, I think they will be able to bail it out, and shall we say, they will be able to resolve the crisis a lot less disastrously than what happened in the United States, no doubt. But so I think but they recognize, what I'm reading now is that they recognize that this phase is to an end. So they will wind that up, and they're now, it seems, trying to direct Chinese savings into the more innovative companies and so on, which the Financial Times calls manipulating the stock market. But whatever it may be, that's the Financial Times and that's the Chinese leadership. So the point is that to me, the road to socialism doesn't spring fully formed from the head of, like Athena from the head of Zeus. It has to be fought for. And so we will just have to see how things unfold. So far, so good. I would say that the relatively progressive wing in China has kept control. And to me, the big difference is that although there are many capitalists in China, although there is way too much inequality in China, something that they have begun to recognize and are beginning to tackle, although capitalists have a lot of power, at the end of the day, the party state is in command. If Jack Ma is not, if the IPO that Jack Ma wants to make is going to be detrimental to China, then Jack Ma will be called on the carpet and told, no, you cannot have this IPO, etc. And I think that the Chinese leadership also learns as it goes. So, for example, with this current housing crisis, one of the problems they're going to have to deal with is that a lot of these companies have been borrowing money from abroad. So they're going to have to, they're going to lose a few reserves. But anyway, they're not going to be worth very much for very long. So might as well use them to resolve this crisis. But in the future, they will have to be more careful about how many freedoms they give to private enterprises to borrow in this fashion from abroad, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the reasons why I still think China is meaningfully socialist. I have no doubt, like I say, that things could be improved, but there is also evidence that is produced by scholars who are not exactly in love with post-1978 China, like Mark Selden, for example, which show that workers do struggle, and they do win gains. This is not something that is kind of impossible in China. So for all of these reasons, I would say that, and finally, I would say one final thing. Today, the Chinese economy has already officially accepted the notion of what they call dual circulation. So yes, we will have exports, etc., but we are also going to expand the domestic market and make that perhaps the main stimulus of growth within China. So to me, I would say that all of this, and China is not a free market economy. There is a lot of market in China. There's a lot of private enterprise in China, but it's heavily regulated. And I think, I said in something I recently wrote that, the rest of the world, with BRI and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and Chinese lending, people are pointing, isn't this all very good? But I say that, third world countries will only be able to take full advantage of this if they do not just partner with China, but also learn from China. The Chinese model cannot be replicated elsewhere. China has its own history, and every country has its own history. But look at the Chinese model. Look at the ways in which they have tried to intervene in the economy, to plan the economy, etc., and apply that to yourself. Because as I've already said, the kind of capitalism that we can now have is really not worth the candle. So we are all going to have to learn to think about organizing our economy in socialist ways. So that's my answer to your question. But if I haven't answered some part of it, do ask a follow-up.
No, that's very good. I mean, in fact, I would say that the explosion of Chinese production, apart from some of its implication towards the working class in China, and that's a mixed bag. I mean, the service sector boom, transportation, hotel, hospitalities, and so on, and people did make upward mobility there, but at the same time, sections of women lost out. You know, precarity of job was restored, and so that's a mixed story about China. And I look at it, my research is actually on Chinese history,
Okay.
but I would also add that the explosion of Chinese production was so much a boon to the global South. I mean, for instance, I mean, my parents were college teachers, but the salary was very low to begin with until 2009 when Kapil Sibal revised the pay commission. So we could never buy smartphones until we got this Redmi phone, or we never had television until Chinese or color television and cable TVs until the Chinese televisions came in. So I understand how much it is a boon for much of the
Working.
global South in terms of consumption of basic commodities.
Although you
Uh,
see, that's
yeah,
what I mean. If I may just pause there. You see, the thing is that if India, for example, simply invites in Chinese goods without is essentially it will permit a level of deindustrialization of the already weak Indian industry, which is
absolutely.
actually quite alarming. And so that's why I say that that other countries, including India, should not just partner with China,
Mhm.
as it has done so far, but also learn from China. Like, how can we strengthen Indian industry, Indian employment levels? I mean, India is in the throes of the most horrendous employment crisis
Absolutely.
ever. I mean, and for that to continue is not acceptable. I think we will not, we will also be going in the direction of some sort of civil war, etc., if this continues, because it is getting to intolerable levels.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was asking basically because I'm not pretty convinced about, for instance, the credit market, for instance, and I'm not someone who associates myself with the sort of Western propaganda that the sovereign debt crisis in Sri Lanka is because of Chinese predatory
Oh,
lending. I
yes.
mean, the data
Yes.
shows exactly the opposite, but data also shows that China and Chinese businesses are increasingly becoming players within the international credit market. Under that condition, because there is an international credit market, supposing how much of a haircut or how much of a moratorium is even possible to some of the sort of bad loans under, let's say, the Belt and Road initiatives and so on. I'm not as sure that China being socialist in the sense that its party still talks about Marxism and communism and so on, will allow them to have that infinite haircut or moratorium. So, I mean, these are deep sort of um, concerns that I have in sort of saying that, oh, China is socialist, and that's the sort of that doesn't mean that we need some analysis beyond that. I see more a lot of
Although
concerns.
I might say that from my reading, at least, I know that China has actually been, it has engaged in a whole lot of debt renegotiations and forgiveness
But
and so on.
within the limits of the credit market, I don't see that that China can sort of uh, give the amount of haircut or moratorium that is needed for the sovereign debt crisis to be solved. And part of which is greatly because of the institutional lenders in the global north.
That's right.
I'm fully aware of that. But what I'm saying is that Chinese lenders are part of that larger institutional credit structure, and unless we restructure that, and unless we dismantle these imperial institutions of wreaking havoc on the global south through cheap short credits, I don't see bright light. uh,
Okay, let me just say one thing. You are absolutely, first of all, let me say that you are absolutely right that, the debt crisis of a lot of third world countries today is primarily due to Western lending, not due to Chinese lending. And the second thing I'd say is that there's going to be huge tussles precisely because all this discourse about Chinese debt trap diplomacy, etc., is deployed precisely to essentially try to ensure that China carries the can for Western bad lending, right? But the third thing I would say is that at the end of the day, for the Chinese, it is much easier to write off a bad debt than it is in the West. Why? Because Western governments are committed to preserving the profits of predatory lenders, which is not necessarily the case in China. So I think that because you see, in a certain sense, what will make the difference, and I hope it will make a difference. I mean, maybe you are right and maybe it won't, but what will make the difference is that Chinese lenders are part of a very different financial ecology than the Western lenders. So with that, I mean, what will happen in the future, God knows, but I would certainly say that much.
I hope you are absolutely right, and I am absolutely wrong going forward. With that, Professor, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, like I just wanted to thank you so much for your time, and it was such a good discussion, at least to my mind. I don't know how you felt about it, but
no, I thought that your questions were excellent, sometimes like really, really penetrating. So thank you very much.
And we look forward for more future collaborations and learning from you.
I hope so for both. Anyway, for interviews and collaborations, ask anytime. That would be great.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Have
you.
a wonderful day. Yeah.
Bye.